Hi, this is Andy Kaufman, president of the Institute for Leadership Excellence Development Incorporated. Thank you for joining us for this premium episode of the People and Projects podcast. Well, hopefully by now you've listened to my interview with Steven Rogelberg. Steven is the guy who does the groundbreaking research that finds that meetings are often a waste of time. Well, you know what? As Steven said in the interview, you know what? Meetings are hugely important. This is not a call to stop meetings. It's a call to run better meetings. In this premium episode, I'm going to go through 10 of my top tips for running great meetings. Now, you know what? If you haven't listened to my interview yet with Steven Rogelberg, I recommend you do. The link is right there in the screen, but go listen to that if you haven't already heard it. And then let's jump in. You know, the first tip I want to share with you is that meetings are an investment. We need to use that time wisely. Have you ever thought of it that way? I have to tell you, when I go in to do a training session, let's say there's 20 to 25 people there, that session is actually a really expensive session. Certainly there's the cost for me to facilitate it and the participant guide and all the other materials, right? So that's part of it. But in the scheme of things, that's really not all that much compared to each of those people. You take their hourly rate, multiply it by 8 hours, and if it's a multiple day class, man, that is a hugely expensive class. Now, please know I'm not discouraging training, but what I'm saying is I think of it that way because that gives me the extra motivation to make sure this is a great use of time. What if you looked at your meetings that same way? You said, man, this every Monday meeting or this every Wednesday meeting, do the math of the hourly rate of each person. Multiply it by that 1 hour or those 4 hours or however long that meeting is. Man, our meetings are an investment. Because of that, I think a really good question to ask is, do we really need this meeting? Do we need it after all? Is this the best way to be able to handle the topic or the objectives that we have? Are there alternatives to bringing multiple people together? Could I do it more one-on-one? Could I just send it out via email? Is it one of those things that's just not that sensitive? You never want to have a meeting just for the sake of having a meeting. There have to be objectives behind it to use the time most wisely. Never forget, meetings are an investment. Now, a clear lesson is that meetings, one of the reasons why they're a waste of time is they just take too long. I mean, haven't you been in meetings before? You're just like, oh my goodness, we have talked this thing to death. Come on, we know what we need to do. We don't need to cover this anymore. We're just running circles around ourselves. A lesson is, what is the shortest time possible to cover the objectives that we need to cover? And part of it comes down to Parkinson's Law. Have you heard about that? If you sat through my project management classes, you certainly know about it. But Parkinson's Law says that work expands to the available volume. Okay, so in Decembers of most years, I get a fair amount of business because people are like, hey, it's near the end of our fiscal year. We still have training budget. Man, we better use it because budgets expand to the amount allocated. Well, this happens with meetings as well. You've allocated an hour for that meeting. 45 minutes into it, we've pretty much covered the agenda. Hey, we still have 15 more minutes. What else should we talk about? No. Shut the meeting down. Often the biggest violator of all this are the recurring meetings, the every Monday morning meeting or the every Wednesday afternoon meeting. What I recommend for those is that you cut the time in half. So if it's normally an hour-long meeting, guess what? You're down to a half hour. 2 hour meeting, 3 hour, half day, cut it down into half the time. Now, sometimes when I suggest this to executive coaching clients, they're like, Andy, you're nuts. We can't do that. But then what I just come back to them with is, what would happen if you did that? What if that every Monday meeting, instead of an hour long, was compressed down to a half hour? Well, first of all, Parkinson's Law would say, if you facilitate it well, you'll get done in a half hour. It creates a sense of urgency. And so we don't waste all this time that we too often do. Now, some meetings, they just can't be done in a half hour, though. They really do need more time. And so you need to allocate time for breaks. It clears the head. It gives you something physical that you can do. It's good in so many ways. One of the things I learned from Tony Schwartz in his book, Be Excellent at Anything, previously it was entitled The Way We're Working Isn't Working, is that never go 90 minutes, actually with anything, but it certainly applies to meetings, never go more than 90 minutes without a break. Personally, for meetings, I like it even shorter than that, somewhere between 60 and 90 minutes. But it's reasonable to take Tony's advice there and just keep your meetings under 90 minutes. But if it has to go longer, somewhere between that 60 and 90 minute point, make sure you give a break. And if time is short, make it only 5 minutes. Make it a stretch break. But I'm telling you, people will be more engaged after you give them a break. Now, similar to as short a time as possible, how about the fewest people possible? Because inefficiency grows as we add more people. Steven brought that up in the interview. his research on this bears it out. And in fact, anybody who studied for the PMP exam has stumbled across the formula for the number of communication channels. Basically what PMI stresses is that the more people you have on the team, the more communication channels there are. So that adds complexity to your communication. Well, same thing in meetings. Too often what we do is we invite a distribution list. Do we need all those people? Or is there a subset? Only invite the people that you need. Many of the other people, what they can do is they can live off the minutes that you send out later, but they don't necessarily need to be in this meeting. Keep it as small as possible. Fourthly, you have to craft the agenda. I think we all know this, right? We all know, all right, Andy, I get it. Meetings need agendas. And it could very well be that you have them, but I can't tell you the number of places I go. They're like, well, we kind of have them, kind of not, kind of have them, kind of don't use them. Maybe we don't send them out ahead of time, so they're not really used that well. Maybe they're in the meeting, but we don't follow them. I am telling you, craft the agenda. You need a roadmap for the meeting. And what you want to do is you want to focus on content that really requires everybody. If there's an agenda item that is just really more of a discussion between you and somebody else, I'm telling you, take it off the agenda. Cover that more in a one-on-one. What's the content that requires everybody that's going to be at that meeting? Now, a couple things I've learned about agendas is there a way you can get something positive at the start? If you can set the tone, something positive, right? Whether it's an icebreaker, whether it's some introductions, if there are people who don't know each other, but something on the positive end. And then what you need to do is make sure you get to the most important topics first. Okay? Too often what we do is we waste time with things that just aren't that important. Then we get to the end and we have to somehow accelerate through these really important things. So most important topics at the beginning. And we need to make sure we allocate enough time for each of the agenda items, but not too much time. Perhaps you heard my interview with the author of The Progress Principle. There are really a lot of really interesting things in that book about how to engage your teams. It's kind of a motivation and employee engagement book with many applications to project management. But one of the things they talk about in that is that you need to make sure you give people enough time, but not too much time. The more time we give somebody, for example, on a task, on a project, the more they're going to waste time up front. Statistically, and we call it the student syndrome, right? They're going to wait and then try to cram it in all at the end. Well, you could say the same thing for agenda items. Allocate enough time, but not too much time, because if you put too much time, there's not the sense of urgency that you need. And yet, if you give too little time, you're really not going to sufficiently cover it, so it's maybe not even worth covering in that meeting. Finally, when it comes to agendas, of course, make sure you follow it when you're in the meeting, but more importantly, from a planning perspective, make sure the agenda gets out ahead of time. Why is that important? Because other participants, they can look at it and say, oh, yeah, I'm on the agenda. I better be prepared. Or how about this one? Yeah, it looks like a great meeting. Doesn't need me. All right, they can take responsibility for their time by doing that. Maybe they can send someone else from their team. Maybe what they can do is say, hey, looks like a great meeting. I'd love to get the minutes, but I don't need to be there for this. So make sure to distribute it ahead of time. I'm telling you, crafting the agenda so you have a roadmap for the meeting is key. Somewhat related to that is that we just need to be prepared. Now, certainly as a leader, we need to be prepared. I've already talked about that a lot, right? Crafting the agenda, thinking through, do we even need this at all? But we're not always the leader. Sometimes we're the participant. And even if we are the leader, we're a participant as well. And so look at the agenda. What kind of pre-work is necessary? Do I need to create that? Does that come from someone else? If it's needed for that meeting, I need to make sure I do it. That's why it's called pre-work. I need to do it ahead of time and make sure I review it. And then part of my preparation is I look through the agenda, think through what is the best way to facilitate each of those sections. Just thinking it through, being prepared so I'm not winging it. And then when we're in the session, we need to find ways to engage participation. So it's not just me lecturing or some soliloquy by the facilitator. And there are so many tools to help us do this. I have a goal whenever I'm facilitating a meeting to get people involved early, minimize my airtime, maximize the airtime of the other people. If we can get them engaged early, they're more likely to stay engaged. Now, there are all kinds of different tools and techniques. I'm certainly not going to cover them all here. But if you've been through any of my project management sessions, you've certainly seen the Delphi technique talked about, where instead of brainstorming and having you standing up at a whiteboard or a flip chart and putting a bullet point up, we're like, all right, what ideas do you have? And just kind of stepping through those. The Delphi technique is you work independently. And let's say you use Post-it notes, and everyone who's part of the meeting puts their ideas down, one idea per Post-it note. And instead of a one-to-many where it's me as the one and the group as the many and trying to funnel that all through me, we've got everybody working at the same time. And after they fill out their Post-it note or multiple Post-it notes, they get up out of their chair and they put it up on flip chart paper or up on the wall or whiteboard. It's just one technique that I'm not going to cover in any more detail in this episode, but it's worth looking into. It's worth pulling it out. Anytime you need to do some brainstorming, it's one way to engage people, a simple tool to use. How about sharing the facilitation? Do you need to facilitate everything on the agenda? I found there's huge value in having different people assigned to different sections. It gives them more ownership. It develops their facilitation skills. It makes sure that they're there. It is win-win-win. I mean, it is really valuable. So just think through, do I need to facilitate it all? Or can I have someone else facilitate portions of it? Part of engaging people is to have them participate. But what if they're not participating? I mean, they're just like looking down. Well, I find it a good technique just to call on people. You know, like, hey, Bob, what do you think about this? And then Bob is going to participate. And once I call on Bob, other people know that, hey, Andy calls on people, so they're going to pay more attention. If someone's being a little quiet, consider calling on them. I find it's helpful to encourage people to stand and move around, especially if it's a longer meeting. Sometimes it's issues with people's backs. Sometimes people are just kind of fidgety. I'm telling you, that's me. I'm kind of a fidgety guy. And so just knowing that it's okay to go stand up, go lean against the wall, go sit over there on that side table, do whatever you need to be comfortable. Because sometimes people are just better learners and better participants. Sometimes we call them kinesthetic learners. They need to be using large muscle groups. In fact, one of the things I find is that depending on what the context of the meeting is, bring some Play-Doh or pipe cleaners or cush balls or toys, something that those people who are more kinesthetic can actually be using or touching or playing with as you're having the discussion. I don't look at that as distracting. I look at that as an engagement tool. Another technique that one of my meeting mentors or facilitation mentors taught me was to deflect to the group. Sometimes what we do is we set ourselves up to be the answer man or the answer woman. When there's a question, everyone looks at us, right? And then we give our answer through our deep wells of wisdom. But that can actually lead to people not thinking on their own. So the idea of deflecting is someone asks a question to you or to me, and what I would do is say, that's a great question. What do you guys think? Or combined with something else I said before of, well, that's interesting. You know, Melanie, you've got some experience in this. What do you think? Deflect. Don't feel like you have to answer everything. In fact, by doing that, you can shut down other people thinking. Now, sometimes it's not just questions in that sense. It's we need to take a vote or we need to get consensus on something. There are all kinds of really cool tools or ways to do that. Something I've just started using in the last year or two is called Poll Everywhere, Poll, everywhere.com. It's like this really cool system. It's free as long as you have a certain number of users or participants or less. And what you can do is you can present a poll and people text their selection or their answer. And then real time, you can see the updates. It's just one of many great tools that are out there. The last one I'll mention as far as a tool, maybe assign someone in the meeting to be the timekeeper. Man, when you're facilitating, you are really busy. There's a lot of stuff you need to think about, and it's very easy to take our eye off the clock. So what about assigning someone to be the timekeeper or using a magic timer cube or some sort of timer that allows you to make sure you keep track of the time? There's so many different ways to do this. There are so many tools. If you haven't gone to a facilitation skills training class or read some books on it or had some conversations with people, or how about this? When you're in meetings, just watch how other people facilitate. Pick up some tips and tricks, maybe in a positive sense because they did it well, or maybe in a negative sense of, I'm not going to do that, but learn the tools. You have to find ways to engage people. Now, wouldn't it be nice if everyone, when they listen to a certain agenda item and maybe you're talking about it and they go, wow, that was brilliant. I love it. Bought in. Let's move on. Wouldn't that be great? But that's not how things work in the real world. We need to anticipate the fact that there are going to be some issues. In fact, you could argue that if there aren't some issues, if there isn't some spirited debate, that people aren't sufficiently engaged. You want to encourage some good debate. In fact, what Stephen said in the interview, remember? He says, we need some more drama. Now, once again, you might think, we got enough drama. But I think the point of that is, if it's just boring content that doesn't really need some discussion, why are we doing this in the meeting? Why couldn't we just download it in an email or in a spreadsheet or Word document or something instead of having us all together? Anticipate that there will be some issues. In fact, what I like to do is think through, okay, for this agenda item, what are the type of questions that might come up? What are some ways that this could be misunderstood? What kind of backup information do I need to have? And you know what I love to do is actually have that as extra slides at the end of my PowerPoint deck. And so that if someone asks that question, I can just whip that out. I love to be able to do that. It shows that you're prepared. Now, because you're going to get some pushback, And because some people won't buy into it, this is where we need to develop our influencing skills. And we have whole classes on influencing skills. And our Leadership Fast Track program puts a lot of emphasis on developing our influence skills. But I got to tell you, you need to develop your influence skills. Because if you try to resolve issues with, well, you know what? I'm the vice president here. This is what we're going to do. If you overplay that card, you're in trouble. That's using your positional power. And there are times you have to use your positional power. No doubt about that. Whether you're a vice president, whether you're the CEO, whether you're a project manager, whether you're just a team member, it doesn't matter. There are times where you have to use that. But more often you want to use your personal power, your personality power, your referent power, sometimes it's called. You want to use your influencing skills. The guys over at the Manager Tools podcast said the real power that you have is inversely proportional to how often you have to remind people of your title. All right. So for example, the more often I have to say, hey, you know what? I'm the VP here, fill in the blank. The more often I have to say that, the less power I really have because I'm relying only on the positional power. So you have to develop your influence skills. How can I take this person who seems to be resistant to what we're talking about? How can I bring them in? It's a great challenge and skills that are very worthy of developing. Certainly you've been in meetings before, right? And people are just showing up late or maybe not showing up at all. I mean, I talk to coaching clients all the time. They're like, oh man, the people just don't show up for my meetings or oh yeah, or maybe they even joke about it. Oh, our meetings always start late. Well, you know what? People vote with their feet. And if they're not showing up or if they're not giving attention to your meeting, you could think of them as rude, or you could look at it as, man, is my meeting delivering enough value? It's very similar with electronics. Let's say someone is on their laptop all the time and it doesn't seem like they're really engaged in what we're talking about in the meeting, or they're down on their smartphone or they're texting. You know, I actually say this in workshops that I lead, that certainly it's good to silence their phones. But beyond that, if I see someone going to their phone or to their laptop, I don't look at them as being rude. I look at it as me being boring. What can I do to re-engage these people? Because people vote with their feet. They vote with their attention. And we need to take that as feedback that if they're not showing up or they're not paying attention, what do I need to do differently? I have to say this is true for me, and I guess probably most of us. We're not as good as we think. We think that just because this is important to us, it's going to be important to everybody else, but that's not how it works. We need to invite feedback. Sometimes it's just picking up on the fact that people aren't paying attention or that they're leaving or that they're getting up and going to the bathroom. Like, this might be a good time for a break. But other times it might be on a one-on-one basis. Just say, you know what can we do to make this meeting a better use of time? Feedback is a gift. And one way to make your meetings better and more engaging is to get feedback on how they're doing and finding new ways to get the participants working more effectively together. Now, you know, some people at the end of the meeting, they want to write a novel for the minutes, right? I mean, it's just like many pages. And maybe for regulatory reasons, or you have some sort of compliance driver that requires that. But then there are other people, just a couple bullet points, are there no minutes at all? So where do you draw the line? Well, my tip for this is just enough. I realize that's very subjective, but it really comes from the agile project management movement that says just enough planning, just enough documentation. Make sure we're not overdoing it. So when it comes to minutes after a meeting, there are a couple key things I like to look for. First of all, who attended and who didn't? I find that's really helpful because sometimes I'm in a conversation after a meeting. Maybe it's a week or two or a couple months later. I'm like, you know what? We've had this conversation before. And the other person's like, nope, we haven't. I'm like, I know we've had this conversation. Well, I go back to the meeting minutes and sure enough, they weren't there. So that explains it. So who was there and who wasn't? In addition to that, what were some key decisions that were made? They weren't necessarily action items, but these were key decisions. It's important to reference that in the minutes so we don't have to make that decision again sometime. We can actually call back to it. And then actions. What are the action items? And the lesson regarding this is the 3 W's. What is the action? Who's it assigned to? And when is it due? Because what I find is if you just put down the action without a who or a when, no one's going to do it. If you put down the what and the who, but not a sense of time frame on it, once again, it can easily drift. So the 3 W's. Now you can put a lot more than that, like what are the primary topics or what was the agenda, but at least those things, that is often just enough. And the final tip I have is related to virtual meetings. And I just had to put this in here because, you know, everything that I've talked about up to this point is really the same for virtual meetings. It's just that it's more complex. You still have to think through the agenda. In fact, you still have to think, do we even need this meeting? Or is a virtual meeting the best way to do it? Is this so sensitive that we need to use a different form? What's the shortest time possible? You know, who are the few people that we need for? All the same things that we've already talked about. It's just more complex. For example, the facilitation skills. You can't see the body language necessarily. And so do you know whether or not they're really engaged or not? I mean, think about the stuff you do. I can think about the stuff I do during virtual meetings. We need to find ways to engage people. So there are 3 specific bits of advice I want to share with you regarding virtual meetings. First of all, if you can, consider using cameras where possible. I find it is so much more engaging when I can actually see the person who's talking. And on a practical basis, I'm a little less likely to go off surfing somewhere else if I know someone's watching me. So it's not about Big Brother here. It's not that as much as it's more engaging. I find when I lead webinars, if I turn on the camera on my end, it's notably more engaging for everybody. So use cameras where possible. Secondly, encourage back channeling. All right, what's that? Well, I learned it from Kathy Davidson from her book, Now You See It. One of the things she talks about in that book is often when you're in a web-based meeting or a webinar, whether it's WebEx or Live Meeting or GoToMeeting, doesn't matter what the tool is, almost all of them will have some sort of chat window. And what we encourage you to do is to back channel, which means actively encourage people to be using that chat window. It could be what they're thinking about the topic, questions they may have, things that they want to add to the discussion. Since we can't necessarily see each other's body language, so we can't see if someone has that look of, I've got a question or a raised hand, as you facilitate, you can keep an eye on that window. You can be getting their feedback, and it is notably more engaging. I do this now for our Leadership Fast Track web-based sessions, and it's just an easy way to make sure that the information is clearly flowing between me and the other participants. Encourage back channeling. And then finally, you need to make sure you check in with people so they don't check out. I mean, once again, think about what happens in meetings when they just go on and on and on. This is a couple years back. It was on Halloween. A neighbor whose kids kind of similar age as ours, I was asking him, I said, hey, Jeff, you want to have your kids go out with our kids? Should we go out together? He goes, I'm in an all-day conference call. All day. Inside, I'm thinking, does that violate like every rule that we know about meetings? All day. Well, sure enough, it must have been like somewhere between 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Jeff knocks on the door. He comes over, goes, all right, let's go. I'm like, hey, did your meeting get done early? He goes, no, they still think I'm in the meeting. He hadn't talked for like 2 or 3 hours. He just hung up and left. Well, you know what? If someone's been quiet on your meeting, check in with them. Hey, Bob, I haven't heard from you on this one. What do you think? Sally, this is related to something that you've worked on. What's your take on this? And the thing is, once again, when you start calling on people, other people realize you're doing that. And in a very subtle way, you're asking them to pay attention. So check in with people so they don't check out. Okay, well, for this premium episode, those are 10 tips to leading better meetings that I wanted to share with you. But you know what? This is my question for you. What lessons have you learned? Maybe it's something that I already talked about that you want to reinforce. What was helpful out of this episode? But in addition to what I said, what have you found that's valuable for leading meetings? What I invite you to do is to leave your response in the comments section of the podcast episode, or go over to our Facebook page and just make some comments there. But what have you learned about running effective meetings? I can't wait to hear from you. Well, thank you so much for being a premium subscriber to the People and Projects podcast. I have to tell you, it means a lot to me. Thank you very much. And if there's anything I can ever do to help you lead and deliver, don't hesitate to let me know. Well, thank you for joining me for this premium episode of the People and Projects podcast. Have a great week.